Hello and welcome back to another video in our continued journey of mastering VARC, and our today's agenda is summary selection, and this is nothing but looking for the main idea in another costume. And hopefully before joining this discussion we have already done a lot of looking for the main idea work in our RC workouts, right, in the passages workouts. So this is not a new challenge, not a new idea. In fact, this should be easier because we are dealing with single paragraphs at a time. So let me straight away dive into the paragraph, and while working it out, try and figure out the methods or maybe the tips and techniques, etc. Mostly it is about comprehension and comprehension techniques that we have discussed earlier. I will also be using rejecting the options as a part of the process for those who are struggling with comprehension and they maybe cannot find the central idea directly in one go. So some of us maybe directly be able to find the idea simply while reading, and some of us might need to go option by option, very manually by fact checking. Maybe they will have to read the paragraph a couple of times, which is okay. We just want to get that mark, right? So let's start with the first paragraph. As usual, assuming that you have tried out the questions by yourself and mark the answer, doesn't matter whether it was right or wrong, you must choose an answer, and only after that check your answer and then come to the discussion, because making that mistake or making that glaring mistake and then realizing it is a mistake is a very important part of the process, because that will help you to realize the kind of confusion that is happening in the head. Once you realize, then it can be rectified, right? So please make sure that you have tried out the questions by yourself and then only you start the discussion. I'm starting with the first question. So let me start with the very first sentence. The early optimism about sports' deterrent effects on delinquency was premature as researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. So slow down. There was early optimism about something. What was it about? It was about sports. So this is one of your characters in the story, and sports deterrent effects. Deterrent means to slow down or suppress. Effect on what? On delinquency. So we are thinking of a relationship between sports and delinquency, and the early optimism was premature. So this is something that again we have learned in the reading section, how to match the subject and the verb to make your reading easier. So the early optimism, the optimism was premature, right? Now I can approach optimism about what? About the sports deterrent effects on delinquency. So these are my main characters in the story. Now, as researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. So once again, sports, and this is another word for delinquency. So these are my main characters. Approach the sentence one more time. The early optimism was premature. That means optimism did not work out. That means it was a failure. As researchers failed, they failed to do what? Any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. Now I'm going so slow because I think a lot of people struggle with long sentences. In case that is the case, one must slow down and approach it like this, very mathematically, with a method, and not just counting on reading from left to right and assuming it will make sense. So you might have to work with the sentence. But I hope the idea is very, very clear. Now if I look at my first sentence, sports effects on delinquency, researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports and deviance. Deviance is another word for delinquency, right? So what do I see? What is the idea that is jumping out at me? That researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports and deviance. Perhaps there was an optimism about it earlier, but researchers failed to find any consistent relationship. I'm repeating it a couple of times for clarity. Now I'm looking at the options. I'm kind of jumping the process. I'm assuming that you've read the whole thing, tried out the options by yourself. And I've seen a lot of people mark this option. I had shared this question on the community tab with the general population. So a lot of people mark this one. So a lot of people mark the first option. There is a direct relationship between sport participation and delinquency, but it needs more empirical evidence. You have kind of missed the point. Go back. Researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. And this option was saying there is a direct relationship between sport participation and delinquency. So now if you mark this option, what this should tell you is that maybe you are hurrying through the paragraph at a speed which is not suitable for you, because if you slow down you will understand that is not too much of a challenge. So maybe you need to slow down and focus a little more, and this is where you're making the mistake. You're kind of jumping the gun, right? So I read the paragraph and see the first sentence is definitely not going to work for me, right? Now you might say I haven't read the rest of the paragraph. By the way, typically isn't the first line, typically not always, isn't the first line of a paragraph often the subject idea of the paragraph? Again, we have seen these examples earlier. Now anyway, let me go through the paragraph. As the initial studies were based upon cross-sectional data and the effects captured were short-term. Now I don't want to get lost in the detail. It was problematic to test and verify the temporal sequencing of events suggested by the deterrence theory. And this whole sentence is essentially telling me that there were more problems. Problems in what? In trying to find a relationship between sports and deviance. Furthermore, if I read the paragraph, the correlation between sports and delinquency could not be disentangled from class and cultural variables known. So not only the problem was problematic earlier, there is another problem. So this is something that we have learned while all those discussions about the central idea, the main idea, the general and specific, the main idea and the elaboration, because this is elaboration happening. You already said the relationship is not working. You are pointing out more and more problems why the relationship is not working. Choosing individuals to play sports in the first place was problematic. So once again I see problem, problem, problem. So once again, if I go to my options and I look at my option 1 and I say there is a direct relationship between sport participation and delinquency, but it needs more empirical evidence. Now you might feel that okay, there are problems, so you need more evidence. But if you go back and check the paragraph, and I invite you to do that again in case it is not clear, you will see it is not mentioned anywhere that the relationship, there is a direct relationship. In fact, it is saying it has failed to establish the relationship, and whatever correlation was found was also problematic, right? So this is how I would go about it. Now hopefully the idea is very clear to me. The idea was in the very first sentence itself. Researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance and whatever further problems in the story, right? Let me check the other option. Contradicting the previous optimism, latter researchers have proved that there is no consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. Contradicting the previous optimism. Now this is the confusing option, because you saw optimism and you know optimism did not work. So this part seems okay, contradicting the previous optimism. But this is where we're talking about concentration and reading in detail, right? Latter researchers have proved that there is no consistent relationship. Forget about that. Latter researchers in the story, go back, are there any former researchers and latter researchers? In fact, or is it that you're confusing this early for former and latter, that okay, and this is a classic sign of again not being clear with the picture or the comprehension of the paragraph, right? So please understand this. Nowhere in the story, if you go through the paragraph, I challenge you to do that again. There is no former researcher and latter researcher. There was an optimism maybe, but researchers failed. Initial studies had these problems, there are further problems, and there are further problems. So again, this is another option which is just factually incorrect. Forget about any confusion in terms of whether it's two close summaries. This is factually just wrong, right? So in case you marked option 1 or 2, you essentially need to slow down, obviously invest a lot in reading, vocabulary development, reading on a daily basis so that there is comfort here. But beyond that, you need to perhaps slow down and get 3 questions right. Maybe you need to go down to 50% speed and understand what's written there, rather than having a half picture and then marking things wrong, right? That has no value. Let me jump to option 4 for a second. Sports participation is linked to class and cultural variables such as education, income, and social capital. Now, part of it was true in the story. If I look at the last part, the last sentences, choosing individuals to play sports in the first place was problematic, which became more acute in the subsequent decades as researchers began to document just how close sports participation was linked to social class indicators. So actually only this much, sports participation was linked to social class indicators. That means whether you're poor or rich, perhaps your sports participation depends on that. Here there is so much more, such as education, income, and social capital. So by the way, all of this was not given in the paragraph. And even if this connection was there, was this the central idea, or is this the problem in the relationship that the researchers were trying to establish? So this is a sub detail of the story, and therefore even option 4 is rejected for me. And if everything is rejected, what is left is the correct answer. And now when you hone in on the right answer, you will feel a certain sense of harmony and balance also. Statistical and empirical weaknesses stand in the way of inferring any relationship between sports participation and deviance. This is perfect because you saw there were problems. So there were problems of statistics and there were problems of empirical data. You don't even know what these words mean. I have rejected the other options, and I know that I could not find any relationship. So stand in the way of inferring any relationship. This is true according to the passage. Go back and check it again. Fail to find the relationship, right? So that's it. My answer should be option 3. I hope you agree, or you should be at least willing to run the process like I have. I have gone sentence by sentence, back and forth, and seen that 1 and 2 were just factually incorrect. 4th was maybe half correct according to the passage, but remember the question is not what is true according to the paragraph. The question is what is the central idea of the paragraph, or what is the best possible summary. That means you want to keep the idea and you want to minimize as much as possible. Something hopefully we have done a lot already, but otherwise also can be worked out. So my correct answer would be option 3. So let's try out the next question, and once again let me start with the first sentence. Now this one starts with the question: should the moral obligation to rescue and aid persons in grave peril felt by a few be enforced by the criminal law? So easy enough sentence, that moral obligation to rescue someone who is in grave peril. Peril means danger, and that moral obligation is felt by a few, not everybody feels it. Now should it be enforced by criminal law? So a very interesting question, and let me continue reading because this wasn't too much of a challenge. Should we follow the lead of a number of European countries and enact bad Samaritan laws? So the questions is the same as earlier, that should it be a law to help people, and should it be enforced by criminal law? That means if you do not help, you will be put in jail or there will be a fine or something. So now my questions are over, and perhaps this is where my main idea starts off. And the story goes that proponents of bad Samaritan law must overcome at least 3 different sorts of obstacles. So let me first find those 3. This is the first one, there is a second one, and there is a third one. Let me go back to my story. Proponents of bad Samaritan law must overcome 3 different sorts of obstacles. So if you want that law, proponent means supporter. If you want that bad Samaritan law, that means people are supposed to help other people, or there will be some penalty imposed upon them. There are these three challenges. Now let me try and understand these challenges. They must show the laws are morally legitimate in principle. That is, the duty to aid others is a proper candidate for legal enforcement. So they must show the laws are morally legitimate. I can say this is one idea. Second, they must show that this duty to aid can be defined in a way that can be fairly enforced by the courts. So I'm just trying to summarize it for myself point by point. Enforced by courts, right? The second challenge. Third, they must show that benefits of the laws are worth their problems, risk and cost. Okay, great. So I see my story started with a question. Should there be a law like this? Should we follow the examples of Europe and enact this law? But then if you notice, the paragraph went into a very specific detailed territory. It said if you want to have this law, there are these three obstacles that you have to cross. And when I read them, I noticed that they all have to do with principles of law, that the laws are morally legitimate. They can be fairly enforced by the court. So the repeating word is law, court, etc. for me. So good, I have a decent enough picture of the paragraph and I'm very excited to move towards the paragraph, and I'm very excited to move towards the options and see whether I can find the summary or not. First option. Everyone agrees that people ought to aid others. The only debate is whether to have a law on it. If you just read the paragraph, you know this is definitely wrong, right? Why? If you just saw the paragraph, you know for sure that this is definitely wrong, because not everyone agrees. Only some people, remember, feel that obligation, and whether to have the law on it or not is not the debate. The debate was whether it can cross those three challenges. So in case you selected this as your answer, you have missed a major point of the paragraph, right? Option 2. A number of European countries that have successfully enacted bad Samaritan laws may serve as model statutes. Again, go back to your paragraph. Majority of the paragraph was about these three obstacles. So you had to somehow bind them together in one idea, and that is definitely not happening in option 2 as well. So I will reject it. Bad Samaritan laws may be desirable, which I saw in the paragraph. So far so good, but they need to be tested for legal soundness. They need to be tested. That's what I grasped in the whole paragraph, that there are these three obstacles. That means there are three challenges, there are three tests that the laws need to face, right? So this is a very good option for me so far. So let me select it as my temporary candidate. Fourth one said, if bad Samaritan laws are found to be legally sound and enforceable, they must be enacted. Actually, the paragraph, if you go back to the paragraph, it did not say that it must be enacted. In fact, the paragraph focused on that proponents of bad Samaritan law. That means the paragraph is not saying that he is the supporter. He is saying if you are a supporter, you have to cross these three obstacles. Whether the paragraph or the writer of the paragraph is saying that they must be enacted is definitely not true in the context of the story. So this option 4 is also out for me, right? And my correct answer is option 3.